You have spent your entire life believing you are a separate person inside your body, trying to survive in a world outside of you. Alan Watts believed this is the greatest illusion we ever learn. He argued that you are not a stranger in the universe, not a lonely ego fighting reality, but an expression of the same force that moves the stars and grows the forests. If that is true, then everything you believe about control, fear, identity, and even death begins to change. Tonight, we slowly uncover the philosophy that dissolves the illusion of separation and reveals what you truly are. Alan Watts begins from a problem that most people never notice. Human beings feel separate from everything else. You wake up in the morning and feel like a person inside a body, looking out at a world that is outside of you. There is you in here and everything else out there. This feeling seems obvious and natural. But Watts argues that this is the central illusion that creates fear, tension, and confusion in modern life. From the time you're a child, you are trained to believe you are a separate individual. You're given a name. You are praised or criticized. You're compared with others. You are told to succeed, to improve yourself, to become someone. Slowly, you build an image of who you are. This image feels solid. It feels like a real thing inside you. But what says this image is mostly a story? It is a collection of memories, labels, and expectations. It is not a fixed object. If you pause and look at your direct experience right now, what do you actually find? You find sensations in the body. You find sounds. You find thoughts appearing. You find feelings rising and fading. But you do not find a solid center that is controlling all of this. Thoughts come on their own. You cannot predict your next thought before it arrives. Emotions shift without asking your permission. Even your breathing continues when you are not paying attention. This does not mean you are powerless. It means that what you call the self may not be what you think it is. What explains that the idea of a separate ego comes largely from language. Language turns flowing processes into separate things. For example, we say it is raining. That sentence makes it sound like there is a thing called rain performing an action called raining. But in reality, raining is just something happening. There is no separate object behind it. In the same way, when we say I think, it sounds like there is a thinker separate from a thinking. But in direct experience, there's only thinking happening. The mind creates the idea of thinker because grammar suggests it. But grammar does not always describe reality accurately. Watts often uses the example of a wave in the ocean. A wave looks like a separate object. It has a shape. It has a beginning and an end. But the wave is not separate from the ocean. It is something the ocean is doing at that moment. If you try to remove the wave from the ocean, it would disappear. The wave depends completely on the ocean. He suggests that a human being is like that wave. You're not an isolated object dropped into the universe. You are an activity of the universe. The same energy that moves the planets moves your blood. The same elements that form mountains form your bones. The air you breathe connects you directly to trees and oceans. There is no hard boundary where you end and the world begins. Your skin feels like a border, but it is actually a place of constant exchange. Heat moves in and out. Air moves in and out. Sensation moves in and out. When you deeply understand this, the feeling of being a lonely individual in a huge world begins to weaken. Let's learn much of this perspective from Taoism. Taoism teaches that reality is a continuous flow called the Tao. The Tao is not a thing. It is the process of everything happening. It cannot be fully described in words because words freeze what is always moving. The Tao is like a river. You cannot step into the same river twice because the water is always changing. Human suffering, according to Taoism and according to Watts, comes from resisting this flow. We want stability in a world that is constantly changing. We want permanent happiness in a reality that moves in cycles. We want control over things that are naturally uncertain. The ego believes it must manage everything. It tries to secure the future. It tries to protect its image. It tries to avoid failure and death. But life does not obey these demands. Change continues no matter how hard you resist. Watts introduces the idea, often translated as effortless action. This does not mean laziness. It means acting without forcing. Imagine trying to push a river to make it flow faster. It is unnecessary. The river already flows. In the same way, many of our mental struggles come from trying to force life to match our rigid ideas. A flexible tree survives the storm because it bends. A rigid tree breaks because it refuses to move. Flexibility is strength. Another major idea in Watt's philosophy concerns time. Modern culture is obsessed with the future. People are always preparing. Students study for future careers. Workers save for future retirement. Even relaxation is scheduled for later. The present moment becomes something to get through, but when the future arrives, it arrives as another present moment. If you're never fully present, you never actually experience life. You're always waiting for it to begin. What compares life to music? The purpose of music is not to reach the final note as quickly as possible. If that were true, the best songs would be the shortest. The beauty is in listening to each note as it unfolds. Life is the same. It is not about reaching a final goal. It is about being fully alive in each moment. This shift changes how you see success and failure. If life is a race toward a future reward, every setback feels like a disaster. But if life is an unfolding experience, setbacks become part of the rhythm. Watts also addresses the fear of death. If you believe you're only a separate ego, death appears as total destruction. But if you see yourself as a pattern in a larger process, death looks like change in form. Just as waves rise and fall, living beings appear and disappear. The energy and matter continue in new forms. He is not asking you to adopt blind faith. He is asking you to observe nature. Everything moves in cycles. Seasons change. Bodies grow and decay. Nothing stands still. Why should human identity be different? The deeper point is this. When you stop identifying only with a small ego and begin to see yourself as part of the whole process of life, fear begins to lose its intensity. You still experience pain. You still face difficulty. But you no longer feel like a separate fragment fighting against an alien world. You begin to feel like life is happening through you, not just to you. This is the foundation of Alan Watts' philosophy. It begins by questioning the separate self, continues by challenging the obsession with control and the future, and opens into a new way of experiencing existence as a flowing, connected process rather than a struggle of isolated individuals. Alan Watts goes deeper by examining how society strengthens the illusion of the separate self. A child is not born feeling divided from the world. In early life, there is simple experience. There is hunger, warmth, sound, light. Gradually, adults begin pointing and naming. This is your hand. That is your toy. This is your name. Slowly, the child learns to divide experience into me and not me. The world becomes a collection of separate objects, and the self becomes one object among them. School continues this training. You are graded, ranked, compared. You are encouraged to build a personal identity. You are told to become successful, to improve yourself, to create a future version of you that is better than the present one. This constant pressure creates tension. You begin to feel that who you are now is not enough. You must always be moving towards something else. Watts believed this endless self-improvement project is exhausting because it is based on a misunderstanding. The ego tries to improve itself as if it were separate from the rest of you. But the one trying to improve and the one being improved are the same process. It becomes a loop. The ego trying to fix the ego. This creates inner conflict. You judge your own thoughts. You fight your own feelings. You try to control your own mind as if it were an enemy. The result is anxiety. The more you try to force yourself into a perfect image, the more divided you feel. Watts explains that much of this struggle comes from the belief that life is serious in a heavy way. We treat existence like a test that must be passed. We fear making mistakes because we believe mistakes define us permanently. But if you see life as a process rather than a fixed identity, mistakes become movements within that process. They do not define a solid self. They are simply events. He also challenges the common idea of security. People believe they will feel safe when everything is certain, when money is secure, when relationships are stable. when health is guaranteed. But nothing in life is guaranteed. Change is built into the structure of reality. Trying to create permanent security in a changing world creates frustration. What suggests that real security comes from accepting insecurity? When you stop demanding that life remain fixed, you become more relaxed within change. It is like learning to balance on a moving boat. If you stiffen your body and demand stillness, you fall. If you relax and adjust with the movement, you remain steady. Another important theme in his philosophy is the relationship between thought and reality. Thoughts are useful tools. They help you plan, communicate, and solve problems. But problems begin when you confuse thoughts with reality itself. You create an image of yourself in your mind and then try to live up to that image. You create ideas about how life should unfold and then suffer when life moves differently. What encourages observing thought without being trapped by it? Thoughts arise. They describe. They judge. But they're not the whole of reality. When you sit quietly and watch your mind, you notice that thoughts appear and disappear like clouds. You're not pushing them into existence. They happen. This observation weakens the idea that there is a solid thinker behind every thought. There is thinking happening, but the thinker as a separate entity becomes difficult to locate. He also speaks about the fear of being nobody. Many people cling to identity because they fear emptiness. They fear that without a strong ego, they will disappear. What argues the opposite? When you loosen the grip on a rigid identity, you do not become nothing. You become more open. Instead of being a narrow character defending a fixed image, you become flexible and alive. He draws from Zen to explain this openness. Zen often uses simple activities like eating, walking, or breathing as expressions of complete presence. There is no need to add extra meaning. When you are fully present, life feels direct and clear. The division between observer and experience fades. Watts also addresses the constant mental noise about the future. Worry is based on imagined events. You create scenarios in your mind and react emotionally to them as if they were already real. This pulls you away from the only moment that actually exists. When you return attention to what is happening now, worry often loses strength because it has no immediate object. This does not mean you ignore practical planning. It means you do not live entirely inside imagined futures. Planning happens in the present. Action happens in the present. Even thinking about tomorrow happens now. He returns again to the idea that you are not separate from nature. Modern society often treats humans as if they are outside the natural world, trying to dominate it. But humans are expressions of nature. The brain is part of the same process that formed rivers and forests. When you see yourself as separate, you feel alienated. When you see yourself as part of the whole system, your relationship with life becomes cooperative rather than hostile. What's believed that much of human misery comes from misunderstanding identity. We cling to a fixed image of who we think we are, and we fear anything that threatens that image. But if identity is understood as fluid, like a flame that continues by constantly changing, then change no longer feels like destruction. It feels like movement. In this view, life is not something happening to a small separate self. It is a single unfolding process expressing itself in countless forms. You are one of those forms, not isolated, not accidental, but deeply connected to everything that exists. This deeper understanding continues to reshape how you see control, fear, ambition, and even death. The more clearly you see through the illusion of separation, the lighter the burden of defending a rigid self becomes. Alan Watts goes even further by examining the deep fear that sits underneath the illusion of the separate self. That fear is the fear of groundlessness. Human beings want something solid to stand on. They want permanent answers, fixed beliefs, and guarantees about the future. The ego is built as a kind of psychological shelter. It says, this is who I am. This is what I believe. This is what I control. But underneath that structure is constant change. What explains that the discomfort people feel when they question the self is not because they are discovering something wrong. but because they're losing a false sense of certainty. The ego feels stable, but it is built from memory and expectation. Memory is a collection of past experiences. Expectation is imagination about the future. Neither of these is solid in the present moment, yet we build our entire identity on them. When you look closely, what you call yourself is a story held together by memory. You remember being a child. You remember certain successes and failures. You connect these memories into a continuous line and call it me. But memory itself is happening now. It is a present thought about the past. The past is not physically here. It survives as an idea in the present. This does not mean your life did not happen. It means the sense of a fixed, unchanging self moving through time is not as solid as it appears. There is a continuous flow of experience, and memory connects parts of that flow. But the idea of a permanent core inside that never changes becomes difficult to find. What connects this to suffering? If you believe you're a fixed self, then any threat to your image feels like a threat to your existence. Criticism hurts deeply. Failure feels like personal collapse. Aging feels like loss of identity. But if you understand yourself as a changing process, these events become part of the movement of life rather than attacks on a solid object. He also speaks about desire and frustration. The ego constantly wants to become something more. It wants more success, more recognition, more security. But as soon as one desire is fulfilled, another appears. The mind keeps creating new goals. This endless chasing produces restlessness. You feel incomplete because the ego is built on the idea of lack. It says, I'm not enough yet. What challenges this by questioning the assumption that you are incomplete. If you're not a separate fragment, but an expression of the whole process of existence, what exactly is missing? The feeling of lack comes from comparing your present experience to an imagined future where everything is perfect. But that imagined future never arrives. When it does, it becomes another present moment with new desires. He often explains this through the idea of play. In many cultures, life is treated like work, like a serious task that must justify itself. But what suggests that existence may be closer to play than work? When children play, they are not trying to get somewhere else. They are fully involved in the activity itself. The value is in the doing, not in a final reward. If life is seen as play rather than a test, the pressure decreases. You still act. You still create. But you're not constantly measuring your worth against a future result. Another deep area of his philosophy concerns opposites. He points out that many things exist only in relation to their opposite. You understand light because there is darkness. You understand sound because there is silence. You understand pleasure because there is discomfort. Trying to eliminate all discomfort is like trying to eliminate all silence. It would also remove the contrast that makes experience meaningful. This understanding softens resistance to difficult emotions. Pain and pleasure are not enemies. They are part of a single system. When you stop demanding constant pleasure, you suffer less from temporary discomfort. What also questions the idea that humans must always be improving. Modern culture teaches constant progress. Improve your body, improve your career, improve your personality. But this constant improvement mindset keeps you trapped in comparison. It tells you that who you are now is insufficient. It creates tension between what is and what should be. Instead of endless improvement, Watts suggests deeper awareness. When you are aware of your thoughts and emotions without fighting them, they often change naturally. When you stop trying to force yourself into a better version, growth happens more smoothly. It is similar to how a plant grows. You cannot pull it to make it grow faster. You provide the right conditions, and growth happens on its own. He also addresses the fear of meaninglessness. Some people worry that if there is no fixed purpose assigned from outside, life becomes empty. What turns this around? If life had a fixed final purpose, then once that purpose was achieved, there would be nothing left. The openness of life is what makes creativity possible. Meaning is not something handed to you. It is something expressed through living. This connects back to the idea of the universe as a process. The universe is not a machine built to reach a final state. is an ongoing movement. In this movement, forms appear and disappear. Human beings are one of those forms. When you see yourself as part of this larger unfolding, the pressure to prove your separate importance decreases. You do not need to defend a rigid identity. You do not need to secure permanent control. You participate in the flow of life as it happens. Thoughts come and go. Emotions rise and fall. Success and failure alternate. Through all of this, there is a deeper continuity, not as a solid object, but as an ongoing process. As this understanding deepens, fear begins to change its shape. The fear of losing yourself weakens because the solid self you were defending was never as fixed as you believed. In its place comes a more relaxed awareness, a sense of being carried by the same movement that carries everything else. As Alan Watts brings his philosophy to its deepest point, he turns toward the question that quietly sits behind everything else. If the separate ego is an illusion, if control is limited, if life is a flowing process, then how should a person actually live? His answer is not a rule book. It is a shift in perception. The core mistake, he explains, is believing that you stand apart from reality and must force it to match your desires. This belief creates constant tension. You try to secure what cannot be secured. You try to hold what cannot be held. You try to define yourself in a world that never stops changing. The more tightly you grip, the more anxious you become. But when you clearly see that you are not separate from the process of life, something relaxes. You're no longer a stranger fighting against the universe. You're an activity within it. Just as the heart beats and the lungs breathe, thinking happens, choosing happens, living happens. The idea of a small commander inside begins to fade. This does not remove responsibility. It changes how responsibility feels. Instead of acting from fear and self-defense, action becomes participation. You respond to situations as they arise rather than trying to control every possible outcome. Planning still happens. Effort still happens. But it happens without the constant background panic that everything depends on a fragile ego. What's often pointed out that the desire for complete control is itself part of the illusion. You do not control your heartbeat. You do not control when every thought appears. Even your decisions arise from countless influences you did not choose, such as genetics, upbringing, culture, and past experience. This does not make you powerless. It shows that you're a part of a vast network of causes and conditions. You are not separate from the forces shaping you. Understanding this reduces blame and shame. If a person sees themselves as a fixed, isolated self, they carry heavy guilt for every mistake and heavy pride for every success. But if they understand themselves as part of a larger process, mistakes become events within that process, not permanent stains on an identity. Growth becomes natural rather than forced. He also addresses death directly. The fear of death is largely the fear of losing the ego. If you believe you're only a separate personal story, then death appears as total disappearance. But if you understand yourself as a pattern within a greater whole, death becomes transformation. The body returns to the earth. The elements continue in new forms. The process goes on. This view does not deny sadness. Loss still hurts, but the fear of absolute extinction weakens. The wave falls, but the ocean remains. The form changes, but the underlying reality continues. Watts also emphasizes the importance of presence. Since the future never arrives as anything other than the present moment, living fully now becomes central. This does not mean ignoring tomorrow. It means not postponing life. When you eat, simply eat. When you listen, simply listen. When you walk, simply walk. In direct experience, there is no separation between you and the action. There is just living happening. As this understanding settles, ambition changes shape. You may still pursue goals, create art, build businesses, form relationships. But these are expressions of life, not attempts to complete yourself. You no longer act from the belief that something is fundamentally missing. You act because action itself is part of the dance. Watts describes existence as more like music than machinery. A machine is built to produce a final product. Music exists to be played. Its meaning is in the sound unfolding. If you treat life like a machine, you constantly look for the final result that justifies everything. If you treat life like music, each moment has its own value. This shift transforms anxiety. Anxiety is often the mind trying to live in a future that does not yet exist. When attention returns to what is actually happening, the imagined future loses its power. You still take practical steps. You still prepare. But you do not live entirely in mental projections. The final understanding in Watt's philosophy is simple but profound. You are not an isolated ego struggling for survival in a foreign universe. You are an expression of the same energy that forms galaxies and grows forests. The sense of separation is a useful tool for communication and organization, but it is not your deepest identity. When this becomes clear, life feels less like a battle and more like a movement. There is still change. There is still uncertainty. There is still joy and pain. But there is also a quiet trust in the process itself. You stop trying to stand outside of life and control it. You recognize that you are life happening. And in that recognition, there is a natural ease. Not because problems disappear, but because the heavy illusion of separateness dissolves. This is the heart of Alan Watts' philosophy. A clear seeing through the false idea of a separate self, an acceptance of constant change, a release of rigid control, and a return to direct experience of the present moment. Not as a theory to believe, but as a way of understanding what has been true all along.